Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so you sent us some really fascinating material digging into Syriac titles and the history of Christianity down in Kerala, India.
Mhm.
And you had this specific puzzle, right, about whether Mar and Marth automatically mean the early liturgy was, only East Syriac.
Right. And if more means the West Syriac liturgy showed up much, much later.
Exactly. So our job today is to unpack that using the history and the language from these sources you provided.
Yeah, it's a great question because, well, those titles do point towards different traditions, different times.
Oh.
But the story in Kerala, it's wonderfully complex, as the sources really show.
Okay, let's jump right in. The titles themselves, Mar, Marth, and Mor. What's the basic story there?
Well, at their core, Mar and Mor, they both come from Aramaic. Syriac, really. They mean my lord.
Well, Lord, okay.
And Marth or Mort, those are just the feminine versions, my lady.
Got it. So what's the difference between Mar and Mor then?
It's basically linguistic, a dialect thing. East
Right.
Syriac kept an older A sound, so you get Mar. West Syriac, that sound shifted over time to an O. So, more.
Right, like you might hear different pronunciations of the same word in different places today.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
And you see it consistently, even with higher titles, like Mar and Mar for patriarchs in the East Syriac tradition.
Meaning, our Lord, my Lord.
Yep. And in the West Syriac, it's Moranmor. Same meaning, just that vowel difference.
Okay, makes sense. A clear linguistic marker for the two main branches. Now, you also asked about North possibly being a title. Did the sources say anything about that?
Yeah, we looked carefully through all this stuff on titles, church terms,
Yeah.
and based on this material, there's no evidence North is used as a Syriac church title like Mar or Mor. It just doesn't pop up in these discussions.
So that part of the question, the North bit, seems like maybe a misunderstanding from the info you had?
It seems that way, yeah, based on these documents.
Okay, so let's set North aside and get back to Kerala's history. That's where Mar and Mor really come alive, right? What did the early centuries look like?
Well, the tradition, of course, goes way back to St. Thomas the Apostle, 1st century.
Right.
But what we have documented, certainly from the 4th century AD, maybe earlier, is solid links with the Church of the East, the one centered in Persia.
Okay, so East Syriac connection from early on.
Very early and very strong.
Okay.
For, centuries. Over 1,000 years, the St. Thomas Christians there mostly used the East Syriac rite. Your sources mention bishops like Mar Saber and Mar Proth in the 9th century, churches named Marth, Miriam Marth, and bishops right before the Portuguese issues like Mar Abraham, all clearly East Syriac in their titles and connections. The evidence is pretty solid for that long period.
But then things change dramatically. This is where it gets complicated.
Absolutely. The Portuguese arrive, 16th century. They push for Latinization, bringing things under Rome's practices. This leads to the Synod of Diamper in 1599. Huge friction.
Right.
The real breaking point, though, is the Coonan Cross Oath, 1653. It was this massive public resistance against the Portuguese attempts to control their church.
And that oath basically split the community.
It did.
Wow.
Into factions. One group, the Putumayor, they basically said, we need bishops, but not from the Portuguese or Latin side. They started looking elsewhere.
Towards other Eastern churches.
Exactly. And that search led them to the Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch, which follows the West Syriac rite.
Ah, okay. So that's the connection.
That's the connection. And the formal arrival, the start date, if you will, for the West Syriac tradition in Kerala is usually marked by Bishop Mar Gregorios Abdal Jalil, showing up in 1665.
1665. Okay, yeah, you compare that to the 4th century. That's definitely very late in the game.
Oh, absolutely. Centuries later.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember, 1665 is the introduction. The actual adoption of the West Syriac liturgy by that whole community, the Malankaro Church, it was gradual. Took maybe a century or two to fully take root.
Okay, so let's circle back to the original puzzle then. Mar and Marth point to that really long early East Syriac period. Check. And Mor points to the much later arrival, post-1665, of the West Syriac tradition. Check.
Check. That basic alignment holds. Mor, when you see it, is a pretty clear signpost for West Syriac influence that came after that 1653 split and the 1665 arrival.
But there's a but. I sensed a but coming.
There's a really interesting nuance in the sources. See, the title Mar, it had been used there for over a millennium. It was baked into their identity.
So it didn't just disappear when some groups adopted the West Syriac rite?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It persisted. Even the leaders of that Putumayor faction, the ones who connected with Antioch, They were often known as Martama.
Still using Mar.
Still using Mar, and you see this even today. Many prominent bishops in the Malankar Orthodox Syrian Church and Jacobite Syrian Christian Church, which follow the West Syriac tradition, they still use the title Mar. Think of figures like Mar Gregorios or Mar Dionysius through history.
Huh. So Mor is the clear marker for West Syriac, but Mar is older and stuck around, even in communities that switched liturgies later on.
Exactly. Because it had such deep historical roots in Kerala Christianity. So seeing Mar, especially after 1553, doesn't automatically tell you if that specific person or church currently uses the East Syriac rite. It could just signify that deep shared history.
Whereas Mor is more unambiguous for the West Syriac connection.
Correct. Mar signals that specific later linkage. Your sources even hint at maybe hybrid titles sometimes, like Moran Mar, showing how these things could blend. Mar tells a story of deep history. Mar tells a story of a specific later shift for part of the community.
Okay, so summing up, you were mostly right. Marth for the early East Syriac, yes. Mor for the later West Syriac, yes. No evidence for North.
Right.
But the key takeaway, the real nuance, is how that ancient title Mar actually persisted across that liturgical divide because it was just so deeply embedded in Kerala's Christian history.
It really shows how language carries echoes of the past, doesn't it? And how traditions aren't always neat boxes. They layer and evolve.
It's fascinating. Just think about that. How a slight difference in saying my lord, Mar versus Mor, can hold centuries of religious history, cultural identity, splits, and connections, all within one region's story. Something to ponder.